The Feast of Tabernacles comes every year in the 7th month on the 15th day. What is tabernacles? What does that mean? It's not a very common word to us who speak English. The word could be translated as, the original word is sukkot, which is the plural for sukkah. And it's something like a tent. Some people say tabernacle or booth. It's some type of structure that's put up with your hands, and it's kind of temporary. The more common word would be tent. So what is this Feast of Tents in the 7th month, which is more or less during September or October? It depends on the lunar phases. Let's read about this in Leviticus. In Leviticus 23 and verse 34 it says, "Speak to the children of Israel, saying, the 15th day of this 7th month shall be the Feast of Sukkot, or Tabernacles, for 7 days to Yahweh." In verses 41 and 40 through 43 it says, "You shall keep it as a feast to Yahweh for 7 days in the year. It shall be a statute forever in your generations." This is forever. It's not something that was just done by the Jews. These are Yahweh's feasts. "You shall celebrate it in the 7th month. You shall dwell in tents for 7 days. All who are native Israelites shall dwell in tents, that your generations may know that I made the children of Israel dwell in booths or tents or tabernacles when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. I am Yahweh your Elohim." So what is the reason that we stay in tents, or we sleep in tents during the Feast of Tents, or the Feast of Sukkot, tabernacles, booths? The reason is right there. So that your generations may know, meaning all of the generations that come later, including us, that your generations may know that I made the children of Israel dwell in tents when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. I am Yahweh your Elohim. So this is important for us. That's why we stay in tents during the Feast of Tents. Many people have said that the Feast of Tabernacles, or Sukkot, represents the millennium. That's fine. That's really nice. That's what I've always heard. But I think we're missing the point that it is these tents that we're staying in, these temporary dwellings that we're staying in. What does that represent? Well, let's look at some of the scriptures that talk about that. In Matthew 17 and verse 4, I'm going to go through these pretty quickly, and you can check them and look them up, or write them down, or press pause as I go pretty quickly. "Then Peter answered and said to Yeshua, 'Master, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, let us make 3 tents, or tabernacles, or Sukkot, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah.'" So evidently in this case, with these 3 men, they could stay each one in their own sukkah. In John 7:2, read that for yourself. That also talks about, in the New Testament, keeping tabernacles, just in case you think it was only kept in the Old Testament. Acts 15 and verse 16, "After this I will return, and I will rebuild the fallen tent of David. I will rebuild its ruins and restore it." You see, there's a lot of emphasis on this in all of the Bible. Tabernacles and tents and Sukkot and these temporary dwellings, they're very important to Yahweh. He mentions them a lot. I mean, after all, his tabernacle is where they did all the rites and the rituals in the times of Moses and Aaron. Then let's read in Acts 18 and verse 3, "And because he worked at the same trade," talking about Paul, "he stayed with them and worked with them, for they were tent makers by trade." So it's interesting that Paul was a tent maker. You could say it was a coincidence, but it's an interesting trade that he had. He was a tent maker. Let's look at 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. "For we know that if our earthly house, the tent we live in, is dismantled, we have a building from Yahweh, a house not built by human hands, that is eternal in the heavens. For in this earthly house we groan, because we desire to put on our heavenly dwelling." So now we see an aspect of talking about the tent as our body, this physical tent that we are wearing, and what's inside of this tent. What is inside of your tent? Let's look at 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 4. "For we groan while we are in this tent, since we are weighed down, because we do not want to be unclothed, but clothed, so that what is mortal may be swallowed up by life. In Hebrews 9, verses 1 through 3, we read, "Now the first covenant, in fact, had regulations for worship in its earthly sanctuary. For a tent was prepared, the outer one, which contained the lampstand, the table, the presentation of the loaves. This is called the holy place. And after the second curtain, there was a tent called the Holy of Holies." So it's interesting because we know that that's called, where the second tent was called the Holy of Holies. What was in the Holy of Holies, that's where Yahweh's Spirit resided. So we have this tent, our bodies. What is inside your tent? Is Yahweh residing inside of you? Is he in your Holy of Holies? Inside your tent? Let's look at Hebrews 9, verses 6 through 8. "So, with these things prepared like this, the priests entered continually into the outer tent as they performed their duties. But only the high priest enters once a year into the inner tent, and not without blood, that he offers for himself and for the sins of the people committed in ignorance." The Holy Spirit is making clear that the way into the holy place had not yet appeared as long as the old tent or tabernacle was standing. Hebrews 9, verse 11. "But now Messiah has come as the high priest of the good things to come. He passed through the greater and more perfect tent, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation." Hebrews 11, verse 9. "But by faith he lived as a foreigner," talking about Abraham, "in the promised land as though it were a foreign country, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, who were fellow heirs of the same promise." 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 13 and 14. "Indeed, as long as I am in this tent, I consider it right to stir you up by way of a reminder." He's talking about his body. "Since I know that my tent will soon be removed, because our Master Yeshua Messiah revealed this to me." So that was Peter talking about his death when he was going to shed his body. In Revelation 7, verse 15, "Therefore they are before the throne of Yahweh and serve him day and night in his temple, and he who sits on the throne will spread his tent over them." This is talking about the people that will be redeemed, brought up into heaven. 21, verse 3. "And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Look, the tent of Yahweh is among human beings. He will live among them, and they will be his people, and Yahweh himself will be with them.'" So there's so much emphasis placed on this tent being our body that we're going to get rid of. And the most important thing is what's inside your tent. And this is why it's important to dwell in tents during the Feast of Tents, or the Feast of Sukkot, or as it's commonly called in English, the Feast of Tabernacles. Because there's so much importance. Look up those scriptures and read them on your own, and take some time to use your concordance to look up some more scriptures. But I want you to also think about the outward appearance. Because that's what this tent is. It's our outward appearance. People have facial surgery and facelifts and nose jobs and all these different things to look good, and we try to look good. But I also want you to think about like a gift. If you look at a gift and you think about the wrapping paper of that gift, do you get a certain feeling when you see a gift? You say, "Hey, there must be something good in there." And you look at the wrapping paper or maybe a bow and you think, "Hey, that looks really nice." But what's important is what's inside the gift, right? Not the outside. What the gift is. It's not the wrapping paper. It's not the bow. So in John 7:24, it says to not judge according to appearance. Also in James 2 through 4, it says that if a man were to come into your assembly with gold rings in fine apparel, and there should also come in a poor man in filthy clothes, and you pay attention to the one wearing the rings,